Hi, everybody. This is the beginning of week 7. And so, first, I'm going to talk about a little bit about what you'll be reading, and then I'll go over a few assignment type of information. So, first of all, after the Crusades, which we talked about last week, there was kind of a move to strengthen the church. And so, there was a real focus on the Pope and the papacy and establishing the papacy as the highest authority. And so a lot of attention and talk was about that. And then, of course, people who disagreed with the role of the Pope had already split from the church for the most part. But there was a few kind of people who spoke against that from time to time. You'll read a little bit about some of that drama. Also, the sacraments keep evolving. And so a couple of issues within the sacraments became, one thing was the selling of indulgences. You've probably heard of this before, but essentially, this was paying a priest money, and in return, you would either buy some time off of purgatory for yourself or for a loved one who had died in your family. I think they believed that the priest would pay or pray in return for your payment, and that his prayers would kind of earn you this time off in purgatory. And this brings up the idea of purgatory, which is definitely one that is a uniquely Catholic belief, and a lot of churches or denominations of Christianity outside of Catholicism don't agree with this. But there are some passages in the Bible that talk about kind of gold that's tested in fire. And this is where we get the idea of purgatory, which just means purification. And so we believe that it's more like a process than a place, but let's say a process that we basically go through on our way to heaven that purifies our soul so that when we get to heaven, we're all equal and worthy of heaven. And I know many people talk about purgatory as more like a place, and certainly that's part of the imagination of it. But I personally like to think of it more like a process, like the gold that's being tested in fire. Gold is more pure the longer it's in fire because the impurities have been burned off. And that's more like how we see purgatory. And I heard someone say once that it's like the car wash on the way to heaven. So it's washing our souls clean and bright, and we're pure when we get to heaven. And so people had this idea that you spent lots and lots of time in purgatory and you made up for your sins there. And so by buying an indulgence, you could free yourself from that time. Also, the next chapter that you read will be about St. Thomas Aquinas. And Aquinas is definitely one of the great minds in Christianity. And St. Thomas Aquinas was an intellect, and he was the first, big voice to really kind of wed logic and reason together and say, by using our brains and not just our faith alone, we know God exists. We can sense God by observing nature. And so he really combined the intellect with faith. And it was a really good movement in the church. And a lot of what he's written is still something we would reference today. And so Thomas Aquinas was the first big voice in this movement of what we call scholasticism. But many people followed suit. And so he wrote several things. One of them is called the Summa Theologia. And in this writing, he uses a process that's kind of unique. And it's basically like, if you ever took geometry, kind of like a proof. So he kind of states something that people that people at the time believed. And then he would use proofs to kind of prove or disprove that belief. And so that was a kind of new way of using logic and reason to prove faith. And it was sort of a thing that nobody had done before, so that was pretty important. Also around this time, there was William of Ockham, who has an idea called nominalism. And without going into great depth about it, it's basically individualism. And so this really did call into question a lot of some Catholic Christian beliefs, because most of the time up until then, the talk was about the common good and the whole, and this William of Ockham gets people to think about their individual needs and their individual relationship with God. Along those lines was kind of a greater understanding or a movement that we call mysticism. And there were a lot of saints, especially, who had a lot of really mystical experiences. This would be kind of like outer body experiences, or like a sense of being separate from yourself, or maybe even going into like a comatose state and having all sorts of visions in that state or something like that. And you'll read about several of the saints in particular who experienced a lot of mysticism. There are a couple people you'll read about as well who were kind of the forerunners to the Protestant Reformation, which is the next thing that we'll discuss. But they start protesting different teachings within the church, and the reaction to them is pretty harsh, as you'll read. But it kind of makes you understand that even like 100 years before the Protestant Reformation, there were certain voices that started to say, I don't agree, or this isn't right, or something like that. Okay, so anyway, enjoy the reading this week. You don't have a discussion or a reading task this week. You just have to turn in the paper outline by 11:55 a.m. on Friday the 3rd. Again, it's just a keyword outline, and I sent you through email a sample. And then finally, next week I won't be doing a video. The only thing you have next week is to take the midterm. The midterm is 60 questions. You have double the time, so an hour and a half to take it. Make sure you look over your notes from the whole semester so far, because the questions are about everything we've talked about so far. So study some first, have your notes available. When you see the questions, try to think about where in the book you would have read about that and zoom into that or find that in your notes to try to save time. If you have any questions, let me know. Again, I won't do a video next week, and I won't do one the week after because that's your spring break. So enjoy, and I will make another video right after spring break. So good luck on your tests. Let me know if you have any questions about the paper outline. Thanks.